So let's start adding controllers to our project. Now, controller is a crucial part of MVC architecture. It uses the model and the view to create the response for the client. For example, when the user clicks a button on the form, the request is sent to the controller, and controller then creates the response. The controller doesn't need to know anything about how the data is stored, whether it is database or just hard-coded in our application like we did so far. So let's add a controller. First, we need to create a folder called controllers because that's the folder where ASP will look for controllers by default. So right-click the project, add a folder, and call it controllers. And let's add a controller into our folder controllers. Now you can choose controller directly, or we can start with a class and then we will turn it into a controller. So this one will be called Candy Controller. It is important to name it as a controller at the end because that's how MVC will know that this class is actually a controller. That's a naming convention that the ASP follows. So again, this is just a simple class right now. In order for us to turn it into a controller, it needs to inherit from controller class. So let's bring in the namespace for the controller class, which is the microsoft.aspnetcore.mvc. And now we have a controller. And because it inherits from the controller, it gives us all the functionality that we need for the controller to work. But still, it is actually still a class, just inheriting from the controller. So in order for us to use the data from our repositories, we need to have an access to them. So we need to bring them into this class, and we do that by creating read-only fields for our interfaces. So into the class, I'm going to bring in the private read-only variable that will be of type iCandy repository. And I'll name it, since it's a private, _ candy repository. And you can see it's complaining because we need to bring in the namespace, which is in candyshop.models. And the next one is gonna be another read-only, and this is gonna be for iCategory repository. And I'll name it _ category repository. So now we have the fields here, and we need to instantiate them, and we do that in a constructor. We will basically inject the services for this iCandy repository and iCategory repository into the constructor of our controller. So let's create the constructor, and we will pass in those two repositories. So we'll have the iCandy repository, let's say just candy repository, and the second one is of course the iCategory repository, which I'll name category repository. So our _ candy repository will equal the injected candy repository, and our _ category repository will of course equal the injected category repository. Alright, so now we are ready to use the controller, and we can start creating our action methods because these are the methods that will be handling the incoming requests. So let's do that next.